This is going to be a kind of overview of key items in the article by Fletcher. Now remember that the Fletcher article is early. It was one of the most important articles in the beginning of this discussion. It came from 1975 out of the Hastings Center report. Fletcher is writing this article to carry on a conversation or even to initiate a conversation. This carries on from an earlier article. Notice down at the bottom, my third point here, he's quoting from Morvan Lebesque, who was writing in response to the thalidomide disaster of the 60s. Those are the kids that were born with severe, or not born, with severe disabilities in terms of their missing arms and so forth. After centuries of morality, writes Lebesque, we still cannot answer questions like those raised by the trial in Liege, and that was the trial of the people who were being prosecuted for having killed malformed babies, right? So the question then is, should malformed babies be killed? No one knows what man is any longer. And that, Fletcher suggests, is the situation exactly, right? So he's looking for a consensus. What does it mean to be a person? What would it mean to have the rights of a person? These are going to turn out to be extremely important in all sorts of ways, right? So in response to an earlier article he wrote, in which he identified neocortical function as the key capacity that makes human beings persons, Fletcher invited responses to that proposal. His aim, he said, was to keep the investigation going. So why does this matter? Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that rights, these legal rights, attach only to persons, which we know from Veitch. Fletcher's raising this up, of course. But I want you to see here, because it's a bit of confusion. This is an early article. And he's making a distinction between human beings and persons. That is to say, the biological entity, which carries the human genetic traits, and those persons or those individuals who are signified as persons and thereby have the rights of human beings or the rights of persons. Now, where is this important? It's obviously important in determining when you've got a death. And determining when you've got a death is also related these days, especially to transplantation, right? You'll remember, for example, the case that Veitch brought up on page 34 of the infants, the 3 small children, infants, whose hearts were transplanted, taken out. A controversy erupted at that point because there was a question about whether the doctors had waited long enough to really establish the fact that these patients, these infants, were really dead. Now, at that point, there was the neocortical functioning criteria, but they had failed, apparently, to fully meet, at least some people thought so, fully meet whatever that looked like. Here's that problem about when is functioning? How do you determine how long it's functioning? But here, in this article, this is early, and this is Fletcher trying to establish this argument that this neocortical functioning or the higher brain functioning is critical, right? So what's his method to establish a new consensus? That's what he's going for. He's trying to convince other people to adopt this criteria that he's offering, right? So he invited responses to an earlier proposal where he said, all right, persons with rights should be limited to those human beings with neocortical function. And he asked, of all the other possible traits that might be considered, which is the essential one without which no combination of the others can add up to humanhood, right? Now notice he's going back and forth here between persons and humanhood. He's not quite clear himself on this distinction. He's trying to create a distinction, but you can really see how early this article is in terms of his confusion on this point. At any rate, he had provided a long list of possible traits, which is actually in the article, kind of an interesting list. And of these, 4 contenders, one of his own and then the other 3, which he thought, he heard from other people who got back to him. And he decided that there were 3 others besides neocortical functioning that he thought were contenders for trying to establish what it meant to be a human being. So the first proposal is probably the one that was most widely held for centuries, self-awareness or the self-consciousness requirement. The notion of having a self at all. And note again the links to the Enlightenment presuppositions here regarding the capacity of reason. Remember, it's only because of reason that we can stand back, I mean that metaphorically, and observe ourselves, remember who we were in the past, and have ideas about who we want to be in the future, right? So we have our own ends, going back to Kant. We have our own purposes, our own sense of what our life, how to define our life. Who are we, right, as a self? That's all related to the self-consciousness requirement. And it's also critical, again, human rights, according to the Enlightened philosophy of theology, rest on this capacity, which reason, endowed by our Creator, and that's what provides individual dignity in the law, or value, allowing for the logical possibility of coherent and successful democracy, right? So that was the whole point of this Enlightenment movement, and many of the early philosophical treatises were about trying to establish that we should be thinking for ourselves, right? We should wake up, time to think for ourselves. We all have reason. We all have the ability to do this. And of course, to do those kinds of things, to make our own decisions, which is critical to Kant, remember, allow persons to always be ends in themselves, you have to be self-conscious. You can't do that without this capacity. So he goes on, once a growing baby's neurological switchboard gets hooked up, he's drawing on the work of R. Du Bois here, allowing consciousness of self to emerge, consciousness of self, he or she then is a person. Reason here, he says, is understood as a verb. Reason is a process. We always think of it as like it's a thing. This thing is just sitting in our heads or something. No, it's a process. It's not a noun. It's a verb, right? It's not what it is, but what it does. So the question here that gets raised on this one is, so who's left out? When does a baby become capable of this kind of self-consciousness? How long does it take? Does this mean that infants are not persons? Does this mean infants don't have rights? Are they not alive? I mean, could we kill infants? Infanticide? I mean, you're inviting this, right? If they're no different than other animals, if we're not calling them fully human or having personhood, how do you distinguish this? And what does it mean if you limit it to people who have this capacity? So the second proposal is relationality. And you remember that Veitch is talking about this when he talks about the care ethic, right? Nell Noddings in the care ethic. I talked about this a little bit in class. Remember that the idea here is that our obligations to others are related to our relationship to them. One of the things that feminist ethicists thought about was the fact that we simply do have special relations. That idea that some people we seem to have more obligation to our own children than to children we've never met. But the Kantian ethic doesn't allow for that, right? So for Kant and the Enlightenment, there's no distinction between your obligation to your own children and your obligation to every child in the world. In fact, to every human being in the world. There are no special relations, not from a moral perspective at any rate. You care about them more, but from a moral perspective, you have the same moral duty to every single human being, every child in the world, as you do to your own children, right? Because every human being is equally valuable. And it creates this duty to honor each person's individual dignity, whether they're known or relationally attached or not. So for the Enlightenment tradition, there is a universal moral obligation, an infinite liability, as some people have put it, right? We are obligated, we have a duty to every human being. If they have a right, we have a duty, right? Rights and duties. That there's a way in which we have a duty, because they're a human being, to honor their dignity, their value. This, for the care ethic, is not going to work out. I mean, the care ethic's just not that interested in that question, except to say, look, folks, relationality has to be taken into account when we think about moral obligation, when we think about duty to others. So if you're interested in this and how it works with euthanasia, I'll be posting another article, if this is not required, but it might be interesting for some of you, by Lisa Cahill. It's actually included with an article on euthanasia by Pope John Paul. And I put it together because Lisa Cahill is a Roman Catholic who argues from a Roman Catholic perspective using the care ethic or the relationality as the basis for understanding what it means to be a human being. So she's arguing from her own Roman Catholic presuppositions that there should be a limited use of euthanasia allowed on the basis of relationality. Her position is that once a person ceases to be relational, once they, in the dying process, as they get past caring about, being able to relate to other people, in some sense, they're no longer a human being. And at that point, it may be acceptable under certain circumstances for euthanasia to occur. Again, we have to ask the question here, so who gets left out? Not only all those, if you're going to follow with relationality without holding on to Kant at the same time, most people want to say we need both of these going. But if you lose Kant and just go with relationality, first thing you do is you lose this idea of having any kind of duty to all human beings just because they're human beings, rather than just the people you are in relational, you're related to in some way, right? But the young people will ask the question, what about severely autistic children? Are they fully human? They have relational issues. Isn't that part of what autism is? Does that mean they're sort of incrementally less human than other people? The minute you tie this personhood, this dignity, the moral, these legal rights to some particular capacity, you're going to run into certain problems here about people being excluded. So proposal number 3 was a capacity for happiness. And interestingly, he did not give us the name of this person. It was a pediatrician at the Texas Medical Center who brought this point up. And she clearly was somebody who was offended by his emphasis on reason alone, kind of an Enlightenment proposal in many ways. This person, she describes her as a she, brought this idea of relationality to the table in some ways, but particularly in light of happiness. I know a little 4-year-old boy, she said, certainly with an IQ of less than 20 or profoundly retarded on any measurement scale and untrainable, right? She wants to say he doesn't meet the standard of reason. He doesn't have a real sense of self in this way we would think about it. But just the same, she said, he's a human being, and nobody's going to tell me differently. He is happy, and that makes him human, or as human as you or I, you or me, right? That's this kid, he may not be trainable, but he's an amazing kid. She described this child's affectionate response, and that sounds like relationality, to caresses and his constant euphoria. I asked her, says Fletcher, if she really meant to say that euphoria qualifies us for humanhood. I took her silence to be an affirmative answer. I'm not sure she would have said euphoria. This sounds to me more like she's kind of linking this back to relationality. This child seemed to have been relational and to be happy. Those two combined, maybe. It's interesting, again, that we see some confusion here about this, what it means to be human, what it means to be a person. Fletcher goes on and says, by human, she meant morally, not only biologically, right? So, in other words, what Fletcher realizes when he receives this letter from this, or talks to this person, this pediatrician in Texas, is that she wants to say, this child, yeah, he's a human being, but he's also a person. He demands all the same rights. He should have all the same rights, dignity, and value as any human being. So proposal 4 is Fletcher's, right? He comes back around to his own here. And he says, I'll stand by my own thesis or hypothesis, it's just a hypothesis at this point, that neocortical function is the key to humanness. Notice, the essential trait, the one essential trait. The point is that without that synthesizing function, and notice synthesizing, and that's an interesting point, it synthesizes other elements, this kind of integrating function, as Vish calls it. The synthesizing function of the cerebral cortex, whether before it is present or with its end, meaning whether we're considering the question of abortion, when is a fetus become a human being or a person, and on the other end, when does a person actually die? When are they no longer a person? So that now we can take their, now they're open for transplantation. He says the person is non-existent no matter how much the individual's brainstem and midbrain may continue to provide feelings and regulate autonomic physical functions. So again, he's talking here specifically about higher brain function, which means that you're going to get these cases where people, their bodies, they can cough and they'll even seem maybe to respond in some ways. But there's no self, he wants to say. At this point, there's none of this also synthesizing function. To be truly Homo sapiens, we must be sapient, wise, however minimally. Only this trait or capability is necessary to all the other traits, which go into the fullness of humanness. Now that is, I think, his key argument, right? Next point. Without neocortical function, nothing else is possible either. At least not these things that we think of as making us human. Not self-awareness, not relationality, not even happiness. Apparently. I could be wrong about that. It may be that there's some kind of happiness. When we read Spirit, we're going to bring this question up again. So as Fletcher reaches the last part of the article, further discussion and reflection, he arrives at the conclusion that there may not be a happy ending to this search for a consensus. And I think that's probably clear. At this point, we're much more willing to accept the notion of diversity on this point. When he was writing, people were really thinking that we were going to be able to establish some kind of consensus. Skepticism about consensus is migrating, he says, into a skepticism about applying whatever criterion we might agree upon. And he quotes here from James Gustafson, an extremely important ethicist of the time, who suggests that any criterion, that is to say, any capacity that we're going to name, becomes a temptation for the fanatics. Now, by fanatics, I think he's thinking the Nazis in particular, to think about a person's adversary as less human than him or herself because this adversary lacks some mental or spiritual quality. This is the sort of othering. They didn't have that word then, but that's what Gustafson's talking about, that the Nazis were doing in their treatment of Jews in Germany during World War I, or in this country in the Tuskegee study on untreated syphilis in the Negro male. I don't know if you know about that. We'll get to that at the end of the course if you haven't studied it before, but what you had there was a situation where they were studying syphilis. Neither consent forms nor treatment were provided. People had no idea what was being done to them. The point is that Gustafson wants to make is the golden rule ethic, that idea that we should treat others, anybody who's a human being, as somebody that we want to be treated, we treat others the way we want to be treated ourselves, that rule that we all seem to kind of know functions pretty universally, but it only works insofar as we see the other as a human being. And one of the ways that we deal with this, one way to justify or rationalize fear and violence against other people that we, for one reason or another, we really don't want to identify with, is to dehumanize them. We just make them not us. Gustafson's worried that this whole conversation between Thule and Fletcher in particular, that focuses on trying to find a given capacity, a given thing that makes us human, apart from the fact that we are biological human beings, something beyond that is highly problematic, and it invites what Gustafson would think about as a sinful response. He writes as an ethicist and a theologian. So he would be thinking here about our sinful capacity to reject other people as human beings. Go back to C.S. Lewis's talks, if you remember them. Remember, he noticed that we struggle to make ourselves appear to be good people. Here, this plays into the stuff that Gustafson's worried about. And so we'll argue not that we shouldn't treat others the way we want to be treated, but that the one we're not treating well isn't really a human being. That's how we're going to do it, right? In order to make ourselves feel like we're good, we will rationalize and justify this kind of behavior. So Fletcher goes on as he's considering other thoughts on other dimensions of this question, that some people, he says, are treating the problem not as insoluble but as specious. Specious means it's not important. You're asking the wrong question here. And that would be William May of Catholic University, who, a lot like James Gustafson, is raising similar questions. But of course, the way Veitch wants to present him, or I'm sorry, as Fletcher wants to present him, as somebody who's trying to justify the prohibition of abortion, right? And in many ways, this debate has a lot to do with what happens at the end of life, but it had enormous amounts to do with what happened at the beginning of life when this conversation first got started, right? This is when abortion was widely accepted. And we're in quite a different place on that point these days. But they're living in a world where they're arguing very strongly in favor of legalized abortion. And in fact, of public funding for abortion, right? So William May of Catholic University is trying, according to Fletcher, to justify the prohibition of abortion, and therefore he objects, as does Gustafson, to Fletcher and Tooley, and those who would agree with them that membership in a species itself is of no moral significance. In other words, what we're saying, what May and what Gustafson are both saying, I think, is that the minute you try and unhook being a human being, a member of the species, biologically determined, and now that would mean genetically determined, the minute you unhook that genetic participation and link our status, our legal status, our rights to having some particular capacity, that you're going to have trouble. And that really they object to the idea that people like Fletcher and Tooley apparently think that being a member of the species, being a human being, is in itself of no moral significance. So they want to argue we don't need this distinction between what's a person and what's a human being. We want to just say human beings have all full rights. All right. So May argues that membership in the species matters most of all. We're human by virtue of what we are and not by what we achieve or do. Now that's a very theological argument. But it's also a very important one, I think, quite apart from theology. It is, you don't get this value or this, we don't have dignity or value because of some capacity we've got. We have dignity and value because we're a human being. Now, I say it's theological in many ways because that kind of argument is based on the presumption that there's some kind of a God there that created us and loves us and thinks the creation is good and wants creation to flourish and endows creation with dignity and value. That would be agape love that the Bible talks about. But this idea that, and this is certainly what's going on with the signers of the Constitution and the writers of the Bill of Rights in this country, the founding fathers, they're thinking exactly this way. That's why they're not thinking we need a distinction here between what's a person and what's a human being. All human beings have inalienable rights, right? So Robert George, who has written an article, which again, I think I will try and post. I can't seem to get it to open, but I think it probably will open. He argues in an article called The Wrong of Abortion that as soon as the full genetic code is present, there is a distinct person. Full potentiality is hardwired in. Potentiality is key here, but it's the idea that it's hardwired. It's built in. You are a human being. You have the genetic code. This particular person has a particular genetic code, and if nothing gets in the way of it, this person will become fully the person that they already potentially are, given their genetic gift. Once it's implanted. But that becomes then an issue in itself. First of all, let me just say that Robert George is a highly regarded ethicist, conservative as a Catholic, but highly regarded. He was on the President's Council of Bioethics. So he makes an argument against abortion, which has a fair amount of, it makes some sense to a lot of people. But there are other Roman Catholic ethicists, people like Lisa Cahill, for example, who would argue that twinning, now if you know what I mean by twinning, but undermines this argument. You know that monozygotic or identical twins, right, prior to implantation are, if you've got one zygote and it splits. And so you've got two, within one sac, two entities here now with identical genetic material. That's why you got identical twins, right? Different than fraternal twins, where you've got totally two separate things implanting from the very beginning. But the interesting thing about the twinning is that it apparently it's possible before implantation takes place, 8 to 10, 12 days, that a zygote can split into two, and then it can recombine into one, and then it can split into two, and it can recombine as one. Now, whether it does this multiple times, I don't know, but it happens that it certainly can become 1 to 2, 2 to 1. And so the question is do you really have a distinct individual, a particular person, from the moment of the genetic coding? And if you really follow what William May is arguing, or what Robert George is arguing in particular, then are these two identical twins the same person? How do you make sense of that? Do they have to share in one dignity? Surely not. Surely there's something that's distinctive about each of these two people, right? And so there are a lot of Roman Catholic ethicists these days who are arguing that we have to take twinning into account. Here's where you can think about the quadrilateral. You're going to take biology into account. Catholics do this. I mean, natural law takes biology into account. And what we know is that you don't have a distinct individual immediately, not until implantation. And therefore, so the argument goes, why couldn't the morning after pill be acceptable? I mean, the idea that you've got an individual from the moment of conception is a difficult concept. The notion of conception precedes what we now know, about how conception works, about how this all happens, what the process is. There is no immediate moment, one moment when it's not until you've got the zygote implanting that you've actually going to begin to have a fetus here. That's the beginning of this. And so there's a lot of debate. This is the kind of stuff that Roman Catholic ethicists spend a lot of time arguing about. But I think it has a larger application in terms of this question that gets raised here by May that says membership in the species matters most. And that idea that there's a danger in separating out the value and the dignity of human beings as human beings, qua human beings, from the dignity and the value and the legal rights of persons who have some particular capacities you don't have here. On the other hand, what that would mean is it gets much trickier to talk about abortion. And it's going to be tricky on the other end, too, to talk about when you've got death. So we've got these two things working against each other. So Fletcher moves on to a guy named Engelhardt, who raises a question which is another broadly discussed issue. The way Engelhardt puts this is, why can't we have a combination of traits that establishes personhood? He's still going to go ahead with the personhood thing, but why do we have to say there's just one trait? Right? His particular concern, though, is that the biological reality of our humanness is not being, he wants to make sure it doesn't get undervalued, right? And what he means, this is when you focus on the cognitive, our cognitive capacities. And again, this is going to show up in spirit. We'll talk about it there. But when we focus on, you're kind of reducing human beings to being brains that are driving around this body, which is like a car. Our brains are us, and our brains are driving the car around, right? And there's a lot of people that feel like that's a big mistake in terms of the created reality of human beings, and in terms of honoring the creation itself, honoring the good of nature, that we're somehow that's a kind of casting off. There's this ancient tradition in Greek philosophy and other places too, but this Gnosticism, this idea that body bad, spirit good, that who we are, our spirits are caught. We're prisoners in our bodies. And so bodies are not associated with myself. Myself is not my body. Myself is just my head, my spirit, my brain. That's what they're arguing against. And I should say, again, the biblical traditions, all the biblical traditions, right? Islam, Judaism, Christianity, are all going to emphasize that you have to take the full bodily reality of human beings into account. That's why you see Orthodox Jews and some others who reject the Enlightenment reduction of human beings to their cognitive abilities, and therefore they reject the neocortical, the higher brain definition of death. And you're going to see this going on in a lot of places. Not so many Christians these days do that, but lots of Muslims and certainly conservative Jews do this. Fletcher's response is that Engelhardt really is not talking about multiple traits, even though he wants to emphasize this bodily distinction. He says he still inevitably gives cerebral function the determinant place. And I think he makes a pretty good argument for this, that Engelhardt, at least, is really falling back on cortical functioning, neocortical functioning. He quotes from him, and this is a quote from Engelhardt: the brain is the singular focus of the embodiment of the mind, and its absence makes a person absent. I can't remember what my word is behind that, but in its absence, you don't have a person. Right? The brain is a singular focus of the embodiment of the mind, and its absence makes the person absent, right? So in regard to the physical biological aspect of the person, points out Fletcher, the brain itself is also physical. So we're not rejecting the physicality, maybe the body, if you think of that as external to the brain, but after all, we are talking about a brain which is made up of, it's itself a physical reality. Though consciousness, as we understand it, is very difficult. No one's figured out yet how, or if it's possible, to link consciousness to the physical brain. I mean, obviously they're linked somehow, but nobody's been able to get that, to put those together. I mean, and there's a huge debate out there in terms of artificial intelligence. And a lot of philosophers on the other side who say, people in artificial intelligence say, look, it's just a matter of time. We will figure out how this machine works, and we'll be able to create consciousness. Other people say you'll never be able to create consciousness because it's something that's bigger and more than an individual brain. It's something that exceeds the individual physical reality. Another fascinating argument that's out there. So Fletcher ends his article by attempting to come to some rapprochement, or kind of, how do I draw these threads together here? And again, he's going to draw them together around his own argument. He affirms the importance of self-awareness and relationality. He kind of skips happiness. But he argues that these two capacities are only factors. They're only possible at all because you've got neocortical functioning, which makes neocortical functioning prior. It's the thing upon which everything else rests, right? Some people will say, life is the good upon which all other goods rest. In some ways, he's making the same argument. Neocortical functioning is the good upon which all other goods or identifying features of personhood rests. You can't have the second without the first. When there is incontrovertible evidence of neocortical death, he says, the human life has ceased. That's where he wants to go with this. Both self-consciousness and relationality are gone. But notably, it doesn't work the other way, right? Which makes neocortical functioning prior. You can lose self-consciousnness, he thinks. He thinks the amnesia, a person who has amnesia, who's forgotten who they were, he's arguing that they've somehow lost their self. They've lost their self in some ways, but they haven't lost, I don't think, self-consciousness. I would argue with him on that. They can't remember who they were, but that they are still standing outside themselves and observing themselves in the moment is still there. And then there's this capacity for relationality. Surely, even people who are severely autistic, and even this child, the woman brought up in Texas, who was less than 20 on the IQ scale, there is a kind of capacity for relationality here that's going on, right? People respond. They are people in a sense, right? That's what she wants to say. So, but as Fletcher says, loss of either one of these or both doesn't mean you've lost neocortical function, right? You can be autistic, you can have an amnesia, but your neocortical functioning is still going on. The other doesn't work the other way. If you haven't got neocortical function, you're not going to have self-consciousness, and you're not going to have relational capacity, right? So that's where he goes with this. And that's where he leaves it. In many ways, I think that his argument for a consensus has been far more successful than he thought when he was writing this piece. Neocortical functioning, higher brain, as we know from Veitch, is widely accepted and getting more widely accepted all the time around the world as the defining moment for death. Now that we can sort of measure this, trying to figure out, we can use brain machines to see where the brain is, how it's functioning. there's still going to be some debates about whether it's got to be whole brain or higher brain, but as Veitch points out, everybody's pretty much accepting higher brain, which means self-consciousness. Once that's gone, and these relationality, all these things, those are going to be gone too. All right, so that's it.